Good evening. Welcome to Cocktails with a Curator. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. The focus of this evening's episode is a drawing by Claude Lorrain at the Frick Collection. Over the many previous episodes, we have talked about paintings, we have talked about furniture, sculpture, decorative arts, porcelain, but we haven't actually talked about any of the works on paper yet at the Frick. The Frick Collection has a very small but rather good collection of drawings. Most of these were assembled after the death of Henry Clay Frick. Frick himself acquired works on paper, but he mainly acquired Rembrandt's etchings and other etchings by Whistler and a few pastels by Whistler. But most of the drawings came later on. As the museum was open to the public in 1935, the trustees started acquiring a number of works on paper. And these go all the way back to the early Italian Renaissance with a beautiful drawing by Pisanello, up to the 19th century, sort of following the guidelines of the collection of paintings. We have preparatory drawings, for example, by Ingres for the Comtesse Sausonville. So that's a very directly linked drawing to one of our works. But we also have drawings by Titian, Rubens, Goya, Tiepolo, Delacroix, and a number of other artists. And these came as acquisitions and later on as gifts. I spoke previously about the beautiful stubs of Warren Hastings, which came as a gift from Charles Reiskamp. The drawing I'm talking about today is actually a drawing that was acquired by the Frick very recently in 1982, together with two other drawings by Claude Lorrain. And I will talk a little bit about the history of these three drawings and where they come from. Of course, this week is the week of Valentine's Day, and because of this, I have decided to show something that relates to a love story, rather odd biblical love story, but love story nonetheless. Frick wasn't so keen on acquiring works of art that related to eroticism or love. Of course, the grand exception is the Fragonard Room with the Progress of Love. So we don't have a lot of love stories at the Frick, but this is one, and a sort of rather curious and hidden one. Now, because we're talking this week about works on paper, because we're talking about love, and because we're talking also about France and Italy, I have chosen a rather strange and wonderful cocktail, which has been invented by a friend of mine in honor of someone else. And this is called Furio Biondo, for those of you who know it. And it is made out of vermouth, gin, prosecco, lime, and you can garnish it if you want with rosemary. And I'm raising a glass to these friends on this very specific week. Cheers to you. So Claude Lorrain is a French painter. He was born probably around 1604, 1605 in Lorraine. Hence his name, his nickname. His real name was Claude Gelée. And he moves to Italy. He moves to Rome as a young man. Curiously enough, he first moves to Rome as a pastry chef, and he works in Rome as a pastry chef. He then studies painting in Naples and Rome with Goffredo Valls and with Agostino Tassi. And he returns in the 1620s to his native Lorraine, where he works for a few years. And in 1627, he moves back to Rome and spends the rest of his life in Rome. Here you see a portrait of him. He is one of those artists who, even though he is born in France and he is by all means French and wrote in a very strange mixture of French and Italian, ends up spending all of his life in Rome, in Italy, and working very closely with obviously Italian patrons, but also producing wonderful views of the Roman Campagna. His great landscapes were collected and beloved in the 17th century, but also later on, especially in the 18th and early 19th century in England. And they become one of the great prototypes for landscape painting in Europe. And of course, artists like Turner later on and Constable to some degree will be influenced by Claude, and many Claudes in the 19th century were in British collections. This, for example, is one of his largest landscapes, the landscape with Apollo and the Muses, which is in the National Gallery of Scotland in Edinburgh. And you can see that in a painting like this, the main subject of the painting is very much in the background. In the back left, just below those trees, is the group of Apollo and the Muses. But really, this is a wonderful depiction of the Campagna, the countryside around Rome and outside of Rome. Claude, of course, is renowned for his harbor scenes as well, another great influence for Turner, for example. This is the arrival of the Queen of Sheba at the National Gallery in London. We have a Claude painting at the Frick collection, the Sermon on the Mount. This was, again, it's a fairly large biblical painting. It was painted for the Bishop of Montpellier, and it was part of a set of two paintings. François Bosquet, the Bishop of Montpellier, came to Rome and acquired this painting in 1656. The painting then went through a series of private collections. It ended up with the Duke of Westminster and was acquired in 1960 by the Frick collection. The Frick is not renowned for its 17th century Italian or French paintings. Frick was not interested particularly in Claude or Poussin or any of those artists. And so, in fact, this is a bit of an exception in our collection, obviously very rich in 17th century Dutch paintings, but not so much in Italian Baroque or French Baroque. So this shows, again, a biblical scene from the Gospel. Christ is with the apostles on top of Mount Tabor, and you see the people below, and this rather wonderful view of the Holy Land with various topographic points about various areas of the Holy Land. Now, the drawing instead came, as I said, in 1982, and it comes from actually a rather wonderful album of drawings. It was an album originally of 81 drawings by Claude, which must have been assembled after his death, probably around the early 18th century. And Claude died in Rome in 1682, so this probably was put together around 1700 with a group of drawings from his workshop. We know that when he died, he left a number of albums of drawings and a number of boxes of drawings. Together, today, we have more than 1,000 drawings surviving by Claude. But this specific album, bound in Rome, appears for the first time in 1713 in the inventory of Don Livio Odescalchi, one of the great Roman aristocrats of the time who had a great collection, who also owned some of the paintings at the Frick, for example, the two Veroneses. But it went through the family, and in 1957, it was rediscovered effectively. And in 1960, it was acquired by Georges Wildenstein, who you see here on the left. And it became known as the Wildenstein album. We know from the 1713 inventory and from an inscription in the album that it had originally 81 drawings, but by the time Wildenstein acquired it, it only had 60. We don't quite know what happened to the others. Some we know were sold earlier on. Some seems to have gone missing before that. And the album contained drawings that were pasted in it in a very haphazard manner. There was no sort of rhyme or reason why these drawings were put together in this album. The album became known as the Wildenstein album, and it was then acquired by Norton Simon. And you see Norton Simon on the right, the great collector in California, the founder, of course, of the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena. And he acquires it in 1968. And a few years later, in 1970, he dismembers the album. The album had conservation issues. Some of the ways in which the drawings were glued onto the album was not particularly well done. So the drawings were separated. There was a number of exhibitions in the 1970s showing the drawings. But by 1980, Norton Simon made the decision to sell the album, to sell the drawings, and to sell the drawings individually. This was because he was worried about not being able to display all 60 drawings in his future museum together. Also, at the time, they were not particularly popular as works of art. And so Norton Simon, unfortunately, in 1980, keeps 7 of the drawings and then sells the others onto the market. They're sold to Agnews and through the dealer, Eugene Thor, with whom Norton Simon was particularly close and had several dealings with him in terms of both buying and selling. That is the moment in 1982 when the Frick acquires 3 of the drawings. Some of the others ended up in private collections. Some ended up at the Clark Museum in Williamstown. Others eventually ended up at the Morgan Library. They've followed various different routes. This is probably my favorite of the 3 Claude drawings at the Frick from the Wildenstein Norton Simon album. And this is a view of Tivoli. And of course, Claude went out into the countryside. He did many of these sketches, probably from life, outdoors, and then back in the studio, he would paint his large canvases based somewhat on some of these drawings. You have these 2 wonderful figures of hunters on the left with a sort of rather liquid ink, and then the sort of misty landscape, probably looking north from Tivoli, outside of Rome, of course, the site of Hadrian's Villa. The other drawing is a much more finished one with pen and ink and white washes. And this is a preparatory drawing for one of Claude's landscape, one of the heroic landscapes of David and the 3 heroes from 1658, which is in the National Gallery in London. The third of the drawings is the drawing showing Jacob, Rachel, and Leah at the well, which instead is a preparatory drawing for figures. It's a figurative drawings, and this, as we'll see, was made for a painting by Claude, and instead of focusing on the landscape, it focuses on the figures, and there are many drawings by Claude focusing on figurative parts of his paintings. Now, what is this story? And the story, as I said, is a love story, is a peculiar love story, and quite a complicated love story. And it's a story that comes from the Old Testament, from Genesis, and it is the story of the young Jacob, who travels to the land of Haran to visit his uncle Laban, looking for work. And he reaches a point in the desert where there is a well, and of course, wells are particularly important for both people and animals in the Holy Land. And as he's there, Rachel arrives, and so this is the quote from the Bible. And while he yet spake with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. And it came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled a stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. And Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. So it is a story of love at first sight. Jacob is at the well, Rachel arrives, he falls in love with her, and he helps her water the sheep. And so here he is on the right with the sheep and Rachel on the left. Who is the other woman? And the other woman is actually not part of this encounter in the Bible, but she comes up later on. And so the story continues, because what Jacob does, having fallen in love with Rachel, is he asks for her hand in marriage from Laban. And Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger, Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. And Jacob loved Rachel, and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. And Laban said, It is better that I give her to thee than I should give her to another man. Abide with me. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had to her. And Jacob said unto Laban, Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to him, and he went in unto her. And Laban gave unto his daughter Leah, his maid, Zilpah, for a handmaid. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, What is this thou hast done unto me? Did not I serve thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me? And Laban said, It must not be so done in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week, and we will give thee this also for the service, with thou shalt serve with me yet 7 other years. And Jacob did so and fulfilled her week, and he gave him Rachel, his daughter, to wife also. So there is this trick where Laban agrees for Jacob to marry Rachel, but instead he gives away Leah, and he only realizes it's Leah the morning after the wedding. And at that point, Jacob serves for an extra 7 years and finally marries Rachel as well. So this is a rather peculiar story of bigamy, really. But of course, there are many similar stories in the Bible. And it's actually more complicated than that, because Jacob goes on being in love with Rachel to father a series of children from Leah, from 2 of the maids, and a number of other women. So this moment of encounter between Jacob and Rachel then creates a much more complicated story. And of course, what happens in painting, because it cannot be represented so easily visually, what most painters show is both Leah and Rachel at the well. And so here you have the 2 sisters on the left and Jacob near the well. As I said, this was preparatory for a painting made for a patron in Antwerp in 1666, which is now in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. And you see towards the center the group of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, and the sheep and the well, very much like the drawing at the Frick. Now, this is the subject of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, which Claude painted a number of times. The scene of the well was only painted once, but before that, he just showed the story kind of summarized in 3 other paintings, which he painted at different points of his career. And here you see them more or less showing the different sizes, a very large painting, a small one, and a sort of medium-sized one, which were done at different points. Now, the first one of these is the one painted in the 1650s, 1654 to 55, which shows Jacob on the left with his sheep, and in the middle, you have in red Laban surrounded by the 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel, in this beautiful large landscape. This was made for Carlo Cardelli, who was an Italian nobleman, for the Palazzo Cardelli in Rome, which you see here on the left, and on the right you see one of the terraces of Palazzo Cardelli with a sculpture, and there was a great sculpture collection there. There are many frescoes in the palace done by painters of like Claude, and Carlo Cardelli had a number of Claude paintings, which were then sold later in the 17th century, in the 1680s. And in fact, the landscape we just saw with Jacob, Leah, and Rachel is the very first Claude, as far as we know, that reaches England already in the 17th century. And this is now at Petworth House in West Sussex. And you can see that it's a fairly sizable canvas. The second one was painted a few years later in 1659, and instead is a very, very small, beautiful copper, which was painted probably for a Burgundian politician, Philibert de la Mer, who was also probably in Rome, and acquired this smaller version of the Cardelli picture. And this is now in Pasadena at the Norton Simon Museum, with 7 remaining drawings from the Wildenstein Norton Simon album. And here you see it much more concentrated, with, again, Jacob on the left, Laban at this point on the right, and the 2 daughters, the 2 sisters, in the middle. And finally, in 1676, Claude goes back to the subject for Franz Meyer von Regensburg, who is a German patron in this case. And here you see a very late Claude landscape with the figures much more sort of elongated, which is a characteristic of his later paintings. And again, the grouping of Laban and the daughters and Jacob on the left. The idea of Leah and Rachel, it's something that goes back to the Renaissance and before, and they're often seen as 2 different ways of life. And so if you look, for example, at Michelangelo's tomb of Julius II, the 2 female statues flanking Moses are Leah and Rachel. And they were often compared as Old Testament precursors of Mary Magdalene and Martha, in the New Testament, the sisters of Lazarus. And the idea of a contemplative life and an active life was something that was often associated with these 2 wives of Jacob. But the drawing by Claude and Claude's description of the scene at the well, as I say, he only paints that once, having painted the subject of Laban and Jacob a number of times, for Cardelli, and then for the 2 other paintings, now the Norton Simon and a Dulwich Picture Gallery. He focuses on the scene at the well, on the encounter between Jacob and Rachel and Leah, only in the one painting at the Hermitage and in the drawing at the Frick, which is part of a set of probably 5 drawings, surviving drawings for that painting that we have, preparatory drawings of different kinds. And it's directly related, of course, again, to the 16th century and to one of the great models for Claude and for some of his figures, which of course is Raphael's Loggia in the Vatican. And the scene there, painted by Raphael and his workshop, is in many ways very similar to what Claude depicted in the drawing and in the painting. So again, you see both Leah and Rachel together, the sheep at the well, and Jacob on the right. Thank you for joining me this evening, and thank you for looking at this wonderful drawing with me. I would like to point out a couple of other things. If you look at the bottom of this page, there will be a link. As you all know, we're working on opening Frick Madison very soon, a new temporary home of the Frick collection on Madison Avenue, where all of the highlights of our collection will be on view. Members will have access to the museum first. So if you are keen to see the museum very soon, you can join below on the link, and you will be able to come and visit Frick Madison very soon. I would also welcome you all to join us next week, where there will be a surprise. So you've all been listening to me and to Amy in the last few months, almost the last year, but a new face is joining us for Cocktails with the Curator. And so I'm very happy to welcome next week our new assistant curator for sculpture, Giulio Dalvit, who will present his first episode of Cocktails with the Curator. So please join us all next week, and look forward to seeing you all soon at Frick Madison.